when Bilkis Bano's rapist got remission as part of India's 75th Independence Day celebration. On what basis, what kind of executive order led to the release of these 11 convicts? Those people that were committing the violence and those that were out there celebrating. I think the middle class in India has been apathetic and not participating in the political process for too long, where we are not appreciating the work of our truth tellers and our human rights activists like Teesta Setalvad, many of whom are scared that they will lose their citizenship under the new Citizenship Amendment Act. A lot of structural violence of caste, religion and gender. Where was the united opposition on this? That's the disturbing question.
Today we have a special guest, Revati Laul. She is an independent journalist and filmmaker and author. The book, The Anatomy of Hate, was published in 2018 and which got widespread reading and discussion. Welcome, Revati.
Thank you so much.
Let's begin with your book itself first. So, your stunning and disturbing book, The Anatomy of Hate, that deal with lives after violently acting out hate in 2002 in Gujarat communal riot. So as a journalist, you followed 2002 riot, and after that you around 14 years you worked and produced a very important book. And normally for a journalist it's very difficult to go through this process because it's very difficult to go beyond daily events, and it needs lots of commitment and courage, the process that you have gone through. And what was the insight and experience when you went through this long process of understanding who participated in the violence and what was the motive behind and what was their role and how they could experience the life after the event? What was your insight about it?
One of the three people who I describe in my book as someone whose name I've changed, who's called Pranav in the book, he is somebody who was a student finishing a master's in a liberal arts degree when these anti-Muslim mobs fanned out all across Gujarat. And he told me in his own words at that time, he said, Gujarat was cut into two even halves. Those people that were committing the violence and those that were out there celebrating. Okay. And I was with the half that was celebrating. Okay. He said, as students, there were Hindu thugs that would come to our hostels and they would say, from this time to this time, you can loot this shop. And after that, the police will come. So you have a window of opportunity. So he said, I didn't want to actually go and loot shops because I'm upper caste. I'm secure in my identity. I don't need to wear stolen shoes. But I didn't want to miss out on the action. So he was like a voyeur. He was someone who was like an everyday, and every like any one of us, like you, like me, something's happening. I don't want to miss out on it. So he went along with the mobs.
Okay.
After the 2002 violence was over, his degree finished, and Pranav was looking for a job. And if you didn't study engineering or medicine or law, then the only way you could get a decent middle class salary was to apply in one of these big international NGOs. And because this was 2002, all the big NGOs now were not working to do anything else except to rehabilitate the victims, the Muslim victims of these violent pogroms. So this young man, after cheering on for the death and destruction of Muslims, found a job to rehabilitate them.
Okay, it's great.
It was the most disturbing thing that could ever happen to him, because until then he grew up in a dominant caste village where there was no need to interact with Muslims. So he could make up whatever fiction about them. These are jihadis, these are people who have many wives, these are people who are violent, these are people, because they kill goats on their festivals, they are breeding violence. This is the kind of stuff that many of us imbibe. So he never actually needed to talk to a Muslim. Now his whole work was about rehabilitating Muslims. So he started to work with them every day, and slowly he said, oh my God, these are people who are exactly like me. They're not different. So what does that make me for wanting them dead? Does that make me a satanic person? Am I the real bad guy here, not them? And it was very scary when this happened to him, because he didn't know who to go with these ideas. So, when I decided that I wanted to understand hate, I realized that hate contains within it these ideas of fear, of not knowing what the other side is like. And this man underwent a transformation.
Okay.
Once he started to work with Muslims, he started to question himself, he started to question his beliefs, and he had the courage to not chuck that job. Whereas many other people who joined like him, they got too scared of these questions, they ran away from that. He persevered, and he then transformed from being an almost fanatic to a left liberal atheist. And I said, how can this happen? Have we not understood anything about hate? If hate can transform, but if you and me as journalists describe it as something that is fixed, then we're also fixing it. We're forcing it to stay there. Someone wants to let it out, but we're not allowing them the chance to. We're saying, you who did this, you who did this, you who did this. We're always pinning them to the wall. So we're not giving them a chance to be any different. So then they become defensive and they become more aggressive. When do you and I become more aggressive about something and defensive? When we're insecure about it.
Right.
But if that insecurity is allowed some space, then it can be released. It becomes ether. It goes out into the atmosphere and it changes. But if we don't allow it, if we don't even want to look at that space, how is it going to change? So we are losing the opportunity every day that we describe something as fixed, of magnifying it and causing it to grow into what it's become now. So I felt that it was important to understand first from this exploration of hate that hate is not fixed, that actually we are doing ourselves and our social structure great disservice to imagine that it is much larger than it actually is. We are actually becoming the PR agents of these politicians of hate. By giving them the imagination that they require, we are giving them that space. We are magnifying their presence by making it fixed and making it so large. We have to see that it is changing and it can become small. Secondly, the other thing that I learned was that one has to work within these spaces. One has to understand this hate, and one has to be able to then try and see what are the other parts of this hate. It is also, the personal is also always political, but what does that mean in the context of a mob? The other protagonist of my book, who's much more disturbing to look at, is a man called Suresh Jadeja. He is somebody who, like Bilkis's rapists and murderers, raped and killed Muslim women and children on a street called Naroda Patia in the city of Ahmedabad in these 2002 anti-Muslim riots. Suresh was one of these people who could have, like many charas, become a lawyer or a filmmaker or an activist, but he chose instead to color himself darkly, become the dada, become the strong man of his colony, so that if another chara, let's say, was a landlord and has rented his house out to someone and they're not vacating, they can't go to the police because the police thinks that they're all criminals. So they'll go to Suresh. Suresh will say, you don't vacate the house, I'll break your legs. So he gets local people who he protects. He has their support. At that precise time, big Hindu organizations like the Bajrang Dal were looking for leaders, and they found some people like Suresh to groom, to become part of their Hindu Sena. What does that mean? That suddenly a man who is anyway performing violence and become the gunda of his area, now his violence acquires a political purpose. And then at that precise time that he is being inducted into these Hindu anti-love jihad mobs, his sister ran away with a Muslim. So he said he thinks of women as commodities. So he says, they have taken a woman from my community, I am going to take one from theirs. And so he goes about seducing a Muslim woman in order to take revenge. But who is he taking revenge on? Himself. Because if he doesn't like Muslims, why is he punishing himself by marrying a Muslim and living with her? And then the strangest thing happens. He falls in love with her. And he can't believe that she can actually like him. So then there's another aspect to Suresh's story. He is also someone who can't stand himself.
Right.
because he grew up with a bad leg. He had polio, and his father used to go around in the village and used to be drunk and say, oh, this, I don't know, this is not my son, he's with his bad leg. I don't know who my wife has slept with and produced this thing, this is not my child. So he grew up hating himself. So his idea of hate and love were mixed up. His idea of belonging is hate. His idea of fatherhood is hate. So his idea of love, romantic love, is also hate.
Very complex situation.
What happens when someone like this is picked up by an organization and propped up as the poster boy of Love Jihad, these defensive squads, who has already a huge personal space of pain, and in a community that has been criminalized? If we don't look at these spaces, now if you look at it from a distance, at voyeuristically, and just look at the surface of this story and say, oh, Suresh murdered and killed and raped people, and we stop there, and we don't look behind Suresh. Who's behind Suresh? People like us who do not understand the pain of the Jharas and their marginalization. People like us who do not fight for the mainstreaming of communities that have been left out. People like us who refuse to actually look beyond just the surface of these crimes and stick with the voyeurism in them. So you and I are also voyeurs. We are part of this performance of hate.
It's very interesting to listen to the story of Pranav, how he could go through a real transformation. So do you think the present Gujarat, after the 2002 riots, could experience this kind of understanding, transformation in a community level, or does it happening in some individual cases, or does the wound created in that riot is being cured, or it is being, the gap is widened recently? What's the present Gujarat situation?
I think these wounds being left open for so long and unaddressed causes them to congeal into hard spaces. So over the last few years that I've been in Gujarat, that I come in and out of the state of Gujarat, that I travel to the state of Gujarat, I've seen that the polarization between Hindus and Muslims is now hardened. It's become fact. It's become as if this is how the universe is, which is very sad, and there's acceptance of it, that this is the way the world is. Hindus are separate, Muslims are separate, the twain shall never meet. That is not the Gujarat of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. However, we should not minimize the struggles that have taken place in the last 20 years, since 2002, by civil society organizations, by some good media people, by aware and enlightened people, to try and work against communalism, to work against casteism, which is also very strong.
Right. And as a journalist, how do you understand the phenomenon of mobocracy? You know that it just did not end with what happened in 2002. We could find that happened in different part of India later on. So it has become, apparently it has become new normal of our day.
Yes.
So how do you understand this phenomenon of mobocracy now?
I think this is our political mainstream, and we as a society are people who live in denial of the violence that we like. We like this violence and we pretend that we don't. I think we've got to be a little bit more appreciative of the truth. We don't like the truth. We have completely obliterated the truth from our mainstream. Until we learn to appreciate the truth and look at it in the face, we will completely destroy the foundation of this country.
And how you dealt in Gujarat after the riot? You are not just trying to understand the victims, you are even trying to understand the people who participated in the violence, right?
Yes.
And we know that political organizations also respond to this kind of events. And do you think that we need a different kind of approach to find a way forward, or to unite the polarized communities? What should be the responsible manner in which, how should the political organization should respond? What's your experience from the?
I think we as a people need to create new politics. I think the middle class in India has been apathetic and not participating in the political process for too long. Until we decide we will be politicians, until we decide we will make the politics of this country. It's not going to change. We want someone else to come and do the job for us all the time. That's got to stop.
And you were one among the petitioners who moved to Supreme Court against the early release of 11 men convicted for gang raping Bilki Banos during 2002 Gujarat riot. And they were killing 14 members of a family. And how do you see the BJP-led government's decision to release them early this year?
Well, all three of us petitioners have faith in the judiciary, and we feel that it is important for the judiciary to hold our executive to account and we have asked the important question, which is on what basis, what kind of executive order led to the release of these 11 convicts. And we are waiting for the judicial process to unfold and to see what happens in court. But I think as citizens of this country, all of us need to ask ourselves, have we stopped watching what our executive does? Are we allowing our executive to get away with anything? Have we become scared to ask questions? Have we told ourselves we are not going to ask questions of our government anymore? Where is the accountability? If the accountability is not there, it is because we have chosen not to ask for it. I'll frame the same thing in a much simpler way. 20 years ago, people didn't care about whether the food whether the food we eat, whether the rice we eat had pesticides in it or not. People ate anything. Now there's this whole organic movement, and now it's becoming more mainstream. So you can find labels on packages in the market which says organic rice, organic eggs, right? Now it's taken a very long time for this demand for organic food to take place. Can we also create a demand for organic politics, where our politics is something that is palatable, that is not infected with poison, the poison of hate, that is causing our political belly to burst, and for us to be in the ER and the ICU politically as a country?
And while the Gujarat government explained it was part of the release of these 11 men was part of their 1992 policy, but we could find that one of the panel members who recommended their release, the BJP MLA, Mr. Rahul, C.K. Rahul, said they are all Brahmins and they are all part of good sanskar. So do you think that if the ruling class support this kind of violent perpetrators and they try to give them a different face, India can be free from this kind of continuous violence against Dalits and other marginalized communities?
That is precisely why it is important for people like you to keep raising your voice and doing the good work that you're doing, in raising your voice and in saying continuously that we are all Bilkis, that all of us will hold our politicians to account, that we will not stop asking questions, that we will ask the right questions no matter what the consequences or how uncomfortable this is for us individually. Remember, during in India, our democracy has been threatened many times, and not just by this administration. We underwent an emergency. There was an emergency rule in the 1970s. But during emergency rule, journalists were unafraid of going to jail. Now journalists are scared to take risks. The middle class, because journalists come from the middle class, and the middle class is much more insecure than, let's say, perhaps a previous generation of journalists that may have come from the political elite. They didn't have to worry about paying EMIs. They all had houses. They came from the landed gentry. It's a good thing that journalists are now not from the landed gentry and from that Mai Bap feudal land owning culture, that they are middle class people. However, they need to be able to build an appetite for risks. Until all of us as a people, and the middle class largely, that controls the politics of this country, that controls the movie going, the imagination, the political culture of this country, that has now become one kind of culture, largely of the culture of hate. We need to magnify all the other parts of ourselves. Yes, we do have a culture of hate, but we also have many other subcultures of resistance, of jugaad. What is jugaad? It is that I will say one thing but I'll do precisely what I want. And you can't predict what I'm going to do next. Those are the good things about us. We have traditions of oral storytelling in which the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are not one. There are versions of the Ramayana in which Sita is the main hero. There are versions of the Ramayana in which Ravan is also venerated. There's not one culture amongst us. If we allow ourselves to imagine that we are a monoculture, we're finished. That monoculture is a culture of absolutes, of hate. We have to allow ourselves to be less scared, to take on things that we know are wrong.
Of course, once we had a history of press which questioned the supremacy of British rule, right? And later on we could find that they have become part of the system. They are not the institutions which could have the courage to question this power, right? And except few online magazines or online publications, most of the print and television media have gone to support the government instead of questioning their act, right? So how do you see the change? So now you explain the responsibility of journalists, but as a media house is not supporting, do you think that individual journalists can break this barrier?
I think so, and I think what we've got to do as individual journalists is to say that we are going to stop running after the big salaries, permanent security, huge mega structures that require big corporate houses to fund them, and then those big corporate houses are scared of income tax raids and the enforcement directorate getting after them, and so therefore this nexus between big corporate money and big media, we can only break it by becoming small again. And small independent publishing houses, small independent media institutions can afford to be radical, can afford to take risks because the amount of money is not so large, the amount of money required to be raised is not so large. One can dream of doing that through individual subscriptions, even though that's very hard. We have to therefore build an appetite for organic news that actually can afford to tell the truth and say, okay, then this means I won't be able to buy presents on Diwali for my children this year or Onam. I'm going to have to also maybe postpone buying a house and continue to live on rent. These are choices we're going to have to make if we really want an organic press. What I mean by that is an ethical press, a truth-telling press.
India is celebrating its 75th year of independence, and the fact remains that the democracy of our country is in a huge pressure. And we know that the accused in 2002 Gujarat riot, they become Prime Minister and Home Minister. And at the same time, the people who strongly stood against, or who were trying to work against the criminals, were put in jail. The RBC Kumar, Tista Selvath and Sanjeev Bhatt, they are imprisoned now. So how do you see the appalling situation of human rights activists who try to raise their voice against injustice?
Firstly, I'm going to divide this question into the two parts that you've broken it up into. As far as our Prime Minister and Home Minister goes, since they have been acquitted by the courts, I'm not going to comment on that. But what I want to comment is the larger political climate of this country that we as a people have enabled, where we are not appreciating the work of our truth tellers and our human rights activists like Tista Setalvad. And I think it is important for us to look very hard at ourselves and say, if we are not going to support them, we have to be prepared to lose our human rights. Because she is not fighting a battle for her human rights. She is fighting a battle for our human rights. So if we want our human rights protected, we've got to stand up for people like her. We have got to not be scared of standing up for people like her, who is fighting for The justice not just of people who are victims of 2002, but the continuing caste and religious violence across the country. For people in Assam, she's been fighting for people in Assam, many of whom are scared that they will lose their citizenship under the new Citizenship Amendment Act. So, there are many battles to be fought in this country that are all very grievous, and we cannot allow the situation of an executive where the people the executive feels that it has the people's assent no matter what it does. Why have we let the executive have the impression? I'm asking us as people, why are we allowing our government to get away with the impression that they can do anything and it's okay by us? It is not okay by us, but if it's not okay by us, we have to stand and make it very uncomfortable for the executive. Otherwise, we have to then live with the consequences of saying we are okay with this executive. Which is it? We have to ask ourselves.
So don't you think even almost all the institutions which are part of a democratic practice system has been captured by the right wings? Even the legal system is not working independently. So how one can, as an individual, can work for democracy and justice in this situation?
I think we need to break up. Hannah Arendt, the writer who talked about the origins of totalitarianism, describing Nazi Germany, she has a very interesting phrase when she's talking about fascist forces, and she says that when there is mass violence, you need to break it up into its everyday banal acts. There is a banality of evil, which means that the ordinary everyday activities which lead to that large, big, fat genocide needs to be broken up into its everyday. What is the everyday support that the German population in the 1930s provided to the Nazis in power? Similarly, in other oppressive states or in places where democracy is fractured the way ours is, we need to look at what is it that you and I are doing every day to fracture it. For instance, Onam is coming up in Kerala. Are we asking the lady who comes to take out our garbage every day to celebrate with us? Have we bothered to find out whether she has the ability to buy anything for her home on Onam? Are we asking our children to find out whether Eid is being celebrated equally with Diwali and Christmas and Onam in our schools? This is the way in which we are breaking our system, because all of the oppression that is around us every day, we have invisibilized it. We really don't care. We are sitting in this lovely hotel just now for this interview, but there is a back service staircase in this hotel, and there's a front staircase for you and me to take. Why are we allowing that, and how can we be a non-discriminatory society when we've got a back staircase and a front staircase? These are the everyday parts into which this discrimination breaks up. How many of us celebrate all festivals equally? How many of us even care about the fact that if we don't, we are allowing our imagination to be only of one type? How many of the stories that we tell, the cinema that we produce, includes characters as mainstream, not as people we make fun of or people who we only objectify as victims? How many stories do we tell where there is a Muslim protagonist who just happens to be Arifa, and who's not Arifa the poor victim, but Arifa who's going and watching a movie, and Arifa who's doing normal things like the rest of us? If we are not going to mainstream people like this, if our imagination is going to be more and more singular and not diverse, then our political imagination is also going to reduce. So we have to, these are the everyday ways in which we can stop invisibilizing the discrimination we practice.
It's very true that we need to have a different kind of approach to fight against injustice, discrimination, inequality, and looking at critically how we respond, not only the political organizations, even the social activists. what kind of new approach we need to have a different kind of impact in a society which is so complex and which is so diverse and so unequally or which experience lots of inequality in everyday life, which you are talking now. So what kind of new approach and imagination is required in our own approach?
I think the first thing we have to do is to not look for a singular approach. We have to have imaginations. Diversity is about many ideas that are contradictory but that can sit in the same space. I think the day we look for one solution is the day we are moving towards a totalitarian state. We have to say, in this place we will allow it to be like one horrendous joint family where we bitch about our mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws and grandparents and children and cousins, and we have to hide things from each other, but we still manage to survive somehow. I think we've got to have that kind of an approach a little bit more, rather than all of us need to agree as one family that we will only watch this movie and we will all sleep at this time and get up at this time. That is a fascist totalitarian approach to living, which is breaking us. And the solution cannot be also a singular one. That no, let's not do that, let's all do this. No, let's all do different things together. That we've never been able to pull off because as a society we are not inclusive. But every day if we break up the discrimination and we talk about it more, I mean, on our 75th year of independence, a boy in Jalore in Rajasthan is killed by his teacher for drinking water from the same earthen pot that was lying in the classroom, and the teacher was a Brahmin. The teacher tore his ears off his face and killed him, and the boy died slowly in bits in hospital for 20 days. How many of us have different cooking utensils for ourselves and the staff working in our homes? How many of us offer the same glasses and water to everybody who comes in regardless and allows them to use the same toilet as us? If we don't, we are allowing more incidents like this to happen.
When we celebrate 75th year of independence, our country is ruled by a force which was trying to make India a majoritarian state. And we know that their work started before independence.
1925.
Yes. And now, so this is the second term of Narendra Modi led government. And we know that you're talking about we need to have different imagination, different diversity. At the same time, do you think that political organizations which is against Hindutva should have a kind of common platform, though they have different kind of approaches in political work, should come together in common platform and they should unite and fight against instead of split it away in different corners? And do you think that there is any kind of possibility will come in future to have?
I don't know what possibilities. I definitely think we need a opposition. Our opposition is fractured and very weak, and that is why our executive can do whatever it wants. It has the majority of both houses of parliament. And I think it is extremely unhealthy for any democracy to function like this. It is absolutely imperative for our opposition to do its job, which it is not doing. When Bilkis Bano's rapist got remission as part of India's 75th Independence Day celebration, where was the united opposition on this? Why is the opposition not out on the streets? Why only common people? I'm glad common people and civil society we are the conscience keepers of the country at the moment. Our opposition has failed us spectacularly. During the farmers' protests, where was the opposition voices? How strong was it? During the anti-CAA protests, what happened to the opposition? How are all these civil society movements generated by people? And people have borne very, very severe consequences for this. There have been cars rolled over protesting farmers.
Do you think the Congress could not take strong stand because they have a group of people who are leaders who have kind of soft Hindutva stand? Is it that weakening Congress?
I think the Congress and many other parties have decided to copy paste whatever the political mainstream is doing, in which case they are not differentiating themselves out from the opposite. So why should people say, okay, there is product A and there's product B that's trying to look like product A, so why don't I just buy A? So actually then they are not doing their jobs as opposition at all. Is there only one political imagination and ideology in this country? And if the opposition is failing, then are you and I also failing to produce a healthy new political party or class? If we don't like the opposition, why can't we form something new? That we're not willing to do. Because we don't want to make our lives uncomfortable. It requires us to be uncomfortable. And that we're not willing to do. We're not willing to do the due diligence required to change things. So that means we're not uncomfortable enough. We're actually okay with all of this. That's the disturbing question.
It's very clear that you are not just working as a journalist but an activist who try to go deeper into issues. And could you just explain to us about the kind of work that you're doing at ground level at present?
Well, actually, I am sitting inside the book that I created 4 years ago called The Anatomy of Hate, and the ideas that the book threw up for me, which were, how do we reimagine our universe as a place where there is space for people who've practiced hate and discrimination to change, and how do we make it change? So I'm trying to explore those ideas on the ground, and me and my colleagues, we formed an organization called the Sarfaroshi Foundation, and we have set ourselves up as an NGO in a part of India where there is a lot of economic backwardness and a lot of structural violence of caste, religion and gender. And so we're trying to see how we can work with people to help them reimagine a world where people can come together and access the system, access their rights together. So by saying that, okay, if your primary health centers aren't working, how do we change our everyday imagination to work against a homogenizing majoritarian culture by saying, if you want to access better health, you need to ally with people of various castes and religions in your own village. If you do that, we can get together, and we got together and we ran a signature campaign, and then the district magistrate of the district agreed to our demands to hold free health camps, whereas there are hardly any doctors available in that district. So how did we manage to put pressure on the district magistrate? By collecting together across different castes and religions. So it is a way of telling people, let's practice these syncretic values. Let's see what it can do for us. And if we can create a positive narrative which has tangible benefits on the ground, then maybe we can power our imagination with these foundational values that India was founded on.
Actually, along with listening to your stories, your experience, it was really inspiring to me to know how a journalist can go beyond their conventional way of working, right? And also, it was really interesting to talk to you. Thank you very much, Revati Laul.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. It's been lovely talking to you.